He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, not because he was gentle, but because silence had long been his armor. Mr. Thomas Green, age 56, lived in a small wooden house on the edge of town. His hands were coarse from years of fixing engines and carrying lumber. He was the type you'd see at the grocery store just after dawn, buying 1 carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and maybe a can of beans. No more, no less. His neighbors called him a good man. Not friendly, not cold, just solid. His wife had died 15 years ago in a quiet hospital room that still echoed in his dreams. Since then, he raised their only son, Elijah, on his own. He fed him, clothed him, kept the roof over their heads, and that was supposed to be enough. In Thomas's world, love was shown through action, not words, especially not those 3 words he had never once said out loud, I love you. Elijah was a quiet boy, bright and observant. He would sit at the dinner table, eyes darting between the peeling wallpaper and his father's calloused hands. There was always something unsaid. He longed for warmth, not just the warmth of a home-cooked meal but the kind that came in a hug or even just a smile. He never got it. Every night, after Elijah went to bed, Thomas would sit in the old recliner by the window. In his lap was a cigar box filled with memories, Elijah's first drawing, his mother's wedding ring, an old photograph of the 3 of them smiling awkwardly into a camera. He would take them out one by one, run his thumb across the edges, and sigh, not out of sadness, but because he didn't know how to express joy. One night, after Elijah had won a small spelling bee at school, he left the certificate on the kitchen table. Thomas saw it. He picked it up, held it in both hands like something sacred. Then he walked to his workbench and tacked it to the wall, right next to a rusted wrench and an old photo of his wife. He never mentioned it, never said, well done, but he looked at it every morning before heading to work. When Elijah turned 12, he asked his father, why don't you ever say anything? Dad? Thomas looked up from the newspaper. What do you mean? Like, anything. You never say, good job, or, I'm proud of you, or. Elijah trailed off. He didn't dare say it. But Thomas knew what he meant. And in that moment, the silence between them hardened like concrete. It wasn't anger that drove the wedge. It was fear. Thomas had grown up with a father who only used his voice to command, punish, and demand. To him, silence was safer. But now, that same silence was robbing him of something far more precious than pride, connection. The years passed. Elijah grew taller, his voice deeper, his questions fewer. At 17, he won a scholarship to a university 3 states away. Thomas didn't ask what he planned to study. He just nodded when Elijah told him. At the bus station, their goodbye was brief. A nod, a handshake. Elijah boarded, turned back once, hoping for something. A wave, a word, anything. But his father had already walked away. Back home, Thomas cleaned Elijah's room, folded the bedsheets, put the old baseball glove in the drawer. He sat on the edge of the bed, still warm with the ghost of his son's presence, and held the pillow close to his chest. Then he sat in the recliner again, cigar box in hand, staring out the window as the sun dipped low. He whispered something that no one heard, not even himself. That night, he placed a sticky note on the fridge, lasagna in freezer. Call if you need anything. It was the closest he'd come in years to reaching out. He didn't know how to say it. He just hoped Elijah would understand someday. But Elijah, hundreds of miles away, felt only one thing, distance. Not just in geography, but in everything. In voice, in memory, in meaning, in the quiet of the old house. Thomas would sometimes pick up the phone, type Elijah's number, and stare at the screen. Then he'd press, cancel. And the man who never raised his voice, never said, I love you, carried the weight of every unspoken word like bricks in his chest. Quietly, always quietly, Elijah's new life began in a city where people rarely looked each other in the eye. The streets pulsed with noise. Screens glowed in every hand, and the buzz of ambition filled every coffee shop. He studied psychology, ironically, to understand why people did the things they did, especially those who never explained themselves, especially fathers. He told himself he was fine. He was doing well in school, made a few quiet friends, even joined a campus poetry group. But sometimes, in the quiet between classes or in the middle of a crowd, he would remember the sound of his father's boots on the wooden floorboards at home. That slow, steady rhythm, firm, consistent, cold, it echoed in his bones. They called each other once every few weeks. The conversations were brief, practical. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Everything good? Yeah, midterms are next week. All right, eat something. Yeah, you too. Okay, bye, bye." It was like they were passing each other on a bridge, eyes straight ahead, never stopping. Each call ended with that same hollow pause, where most people might say, "I love you," or "take care." But Thomas just hung up, and Elijah just stared at his screen, waiting for a dial tone to mean something. At one point, Elijah met a girl named Serena. She had a laugh like wind chimes and eyes that saw straight through him. On their 5th date, she asked, "So, what's your dad like?" Elijah paused, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had too many. "He's quiet, reliable, fixes things, doesn't talk much." Serena smiled. "But do you guys talk? Like really talk?" He shrugged. "We talk the way bricks talk. They hold things up, side by side, but never really touch." She chuckled, but Elijah didn't. Something in his chest tightened. Thanksgiving break came. Elijah had planned to go home, but the thought of sitting in silence for 3 days felt heavier than his textbooks. So he stayed on campus and lied to his father about a group project. Thomas, predictably, didn't question it, just said, "All right, stay warm." That night, Elijah found himself standing by the campus lake. The air was crisp, the trees bare. He pulled out his phone, stared at his father's number, then slipped it back in his pocket. Instead, he wrote a poem on his notes app. "My father is a room with no windows. I knock, and knock, and knock, but the light never answers." He never shared the poem with anyone, but he read it often. Meanwhile, back in his small wooden house, Thomas kept a routine. Wake at 5:30, black coffee, newspaper, work, fix the shed, heat up canned soup, watch the 9 o'clock news, fall asleep in the recliner. But there were changes too, small, private ones. He had started recording little voice memos on an old cassette recorder he found in the garage. They weren't meant for anyone, maybe not even for himself. "Today I saw a kid riding a bike that looked just like Elijah's. He had that same wobble when turning left." Or, "I fixed the heater. It made the same knocking sound you used to complain about. Still does." He never labeled the tapes, just stacked them in a shoebox, as if time could be cataloged and forgiven through whispers to a machine. One day, Thomas called Elijah. It rang 4 times before voicemail picked up. "Hey, it's me. Just wanted to say I replaced the porch light. It's brighter now. Okay. Bye." He sat holding the phone long after the beep, staring into nothing. The porch light flickered once and held steady. Elijah never checked that voicemail. He had started avoiding his father's calls. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from waiting for something that never arrives. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when both of them came close, when Thomas would reach for the phone but stop. When Elijah would draft a message but never send. The moments passed like trains in the night, each one a missed opportunity whistling into darkness. One snowy evening, Elijah sat in his dorm room watching an old family video he had digitized for a class project. It showed his 4th birthday. His mother, still alive then, helped him blow out candles. And there, in the background, was Thomas, holding a camera, slightly smiling, just for a second. That smile haunted him, because it reminded him that maybe, just maybe, his father had always felt more than he showed. But feelings not expressed, no matter how deeply held, grow cold with time, like a fire left unfed. And now, as the seasons passed, Elijah wondered if the silence had already frozen into something unbreakable. And in the quiet between them, a canyon opened, wide, deep, silent. It was on a Sunday morning, just as the frost was beginning to settle on the edges of the old window panes. That Thomas Green sat at his kitchen table longer than usual. He stared at his coffee, now cold, untouched. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of wood contracting in the cold. Outside, A thin mist hugged the yard like a memory refusing to leave. Thomas had been feeling something unfamiliar lately, restlessness. It wasn't physical. His body still moved with the same slow determination. But his mind, it wandered. It wandered back to a boy on a bicycle. A boy with a gap-toothed smile, holding up a test paper with a bold red A. A boy who had stopped calling. He opened the drawer beneath the microwave and pulled out a yellow notepad. His hands hovered for a moment before he picked up the pen. The words didn't come immediately. They arrived slowly, cautiously, like guests unsure if they were welcome. Elijah, I don't know if I'll ever say this out loud, but I figured maybe writing it down is a start. He paused, crossed it out, started again. Son, there are things I should have said years ago. Things I thought were understood just because I was there. But now I realize presence isn't always proof of love, not the way you might have needed it. His handwriting was rough, uneven. He wasn't used to writing more than grocery lists or reminders. But now, the words began to flow. I remember the first time you rode your bike without training wheels. You fell 3 times. I didn't run to you, I stood back, thinking that was what made a man. I was wrong. You got up, bleeding from your knee, looked at me, and said nothing. I've never forgiven myself for not walking over. Not even once. Thomas stopped. His eyes stung. He reached for his glasses, then put them down again. He took a shaky breath and continued. When your mom died, I didn't know how to grieve and raise you at the same time. I chose survival. I chose silence. It was easier than saying I was scared. That I missed her. That I needed help. You were just a kid. But I leaned on you in ways I shouldn't have. The letter grew longer, spilling past the first page. There were apologies hidden in every line, not just for things done, but things never done. Not just for words said, but for all the ones withheld. You've grown into someone I don't really know anymore. That's my fault. But if there's still a space for me, somewhere in your life, even a small corner, I want to be better. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it, and I'm sorry. He ended with something he hadn't written or spoken in decades. I love you, son. I always have. I just didn't know how to say it. Thomas folded the letter carefully, as if it might tear from the weight of emotion. He slipped it into an envelope but didn't write an address. He didn't place a stamp. Instead, he slid it into the cigar box where Elijah's drawings and school ribbons rested. He sat back, exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, relief. Maybe, or the ache that follows release. He never told anyone about the letter. Not the mailman. Not his coworker at the auto shop. He kept on with his life. Wake up. Work. Eat. Sleep. But now, something had shifted. Every night, before falling asleep, he would open the cigar box and touch the envelope. Just to know it was still there. The gesture became a ritual, his silent prayer. His unopened truth. Back in the city, Elijah sat alone in a quiet cafe one evening. The place smelled of cinnamon and espresso. He had just left a group meeting where someone shared a story about their father's final voicemail. The words, "I'm proud of you," had made the whole room tear up. Elijah smiled politely but left early. His chest tight, he walked aimlessly under yellow streetlights, unsure whether he felt anger, grief, or just a hollow kind of wondering. Then, for no reason at all, he called his father. No answer. Straight to voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. Later that night, Thomas saw the missed call. He stared at the screen, thumb trembling above the "call back" button. But he didn't press it. He just sat there, phone in hand, the house dark around him. 2 hearts, divided by miles and years. Both waiting, hesitating, hoping the other would go first. And the letter, the message that could have changed everything, remained sealed. Unread, buried beneath years of unspoken love. It was a Thursday when the call came. Elijah had just left class, earbuds in, halfway through a podcast when his phone buzzed. The caller ID read, County Medical Center. He stared at it, confused, then answered, "Hello? Is this Mr. Elijah Green?" "Yes. We're calling about your father. He was brought in this morning. A coworker found him collapsed at the auto shop. I'm very sorry, but he didn't make it." The words didn't land at first. It was like hearing a story in a language he didn't understand. The woman kept talking, but all he could hear was the silence growing louder in his chest. Hours later, Elijah stood in front of the small wooden house he hadn't visited in almost 2 years. The porch light his father had once mentioned flickered as he stepped up. He entered with the spare key still hidden in the flower pot, just as it had always been. The house smelled the same, old pinewood, engine oil, and something faintly warm, like time itself. He walked through the rooms slowly, running his fingers across dusty tabletops, touching objects like they might speak to him. The recliner by the window still held the shape of his father's frame. A mug of unfinished coffee sat on the side table, cold, just like that day years ago. His chest tightened. On the kitchen counter was a paper bag labeled, "For Elijah." Inside were frozen meals, some toiletries, and a new toothbrush. It was such a small, fatherly gesture that it undid him completely. He wandered into his old bedroom. Nothing had changed. The books on the shelf were untouched. The baseball glove still sat in the drawer. And on the desk was the cigar box. Elijah opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the usual things: old report cards, his baby photo, the charm bracelet his mother used to wear, and one envelope, his name written in rough letters. He froze. Slowly, he unfolded the pages. The ink had smudged slightly where the pen had pressed too hard. Or maybe where tears had fallen. As he read, his throat closed. The room disappeared. All that remained were the words, raw, broken, beautiful. By the time he reached the final line, "I love you, son. I always have. I just didn't know how to say it." His face was wet. He didn't know how long he had been crying. He read it again, and again. Each time, the words grew heavier and lighter all at once. Later that night, sitting in the recliner his father once called his own, Elijah listened to the old cassette tapes in the shoebox. The crackling recordings, the murmured stories, the memories spoken to no one. Every fragment was a piece of the father he never truly knew. In that silence, he found his voice. A week later, he stood at the funeral, simple, small, just a few coworkers and distant neighbors. When it was his turn to speak, Elijah walked up holding the letter. His hands shook. My father wasn't a man of many words. In fact, he said very little. But last week, I found something he never meant to send. A letter, a message, and in that letter, he finally said the words I think he'd been carrying his whole life. He looked at the crowd, then back at the page. And I want to say something too. Not just to him, but to anyone here who might need to hear it. He paused, breathing in deep. Don't wait. Don't assume they know. Say it. Call your mom. Hug your dad. Tell your kid you're proud of them. Tell someone you love them, while they're still here to hear it. There was silence, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of memory, of love finally spoken. Months later, Elijah started a small podcast. He called it Letters Unsent. Each episode was a story someone never got to tell, or words they never dared to say. It grew slowly, but steadily. People listened, and they wrote in, and they healed. And in every episode, at the very end, he would close with the same words. This story was for my father. I love you. I just wish I'd said it sooner. Sometimes, after recording, Elijah would sit alone in the studio and speak directly into the mic, not for the audience, but for the ghost of a man who had loved him in silence. He'd read old journal entries, play fragments of those cassette tapes, or simply sit in silence for a full minute to honor what was never said. He received emails from strangers, sons who forgave fathers, daughters who called mothers, families reunited by a single sentence. And though Thomas Green had never known what would come of that letter, his final gift had rippled far beyond a single life. It became a whisper that traveled, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Sometimes, the words we don't say become louder than the ones we do. They echo in empty rooms, fill the silence between phone calls, and linger in our memories like a song unfinished. Thomas never found the courage to speak his love aloud. But in the end, even a letter, left unsent, was enough to heal a wound years in the making. If you're holding back something kind, something true, something needed, don't wait for the perfect moment. Say it, while they're still here, while you're still close. Because sometimes, a whisper is all it takes to change everything.